Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dawn Kalea, editor of Report on Business magazine here at the Globe and Mail. Before we get started with today's program, I'd like to acknowledge that the Globe and Mail's headquarters is situated on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. My colleagues and I are grateful for the opportunity to live and work on this land, but I'd like to add that I believe it's time to move beyond mere acknowledgement and start working toward actual reconciliation, including of the economic variety, actively helping Indigenous communities control their own fates and giving them equal access to the many riches we're lucky enough to enjoy as settlers in this country. As business leaders, you all have a part to play, and I hope you'll consider using your power to help. So hi, it's always an awkward transition from that. I'd like to welcome both those of you in the room and those joining us virtually for today's event. And now to the topic at hand. We all recognize we're in a climate crisis, with some of us recognizing it more clearly than others, of course. And though many businesses across Canada's economy have embarked on programs to achieve net zero emissions, not very many of them have been moving quickly enough, bogged down more in the reporting than in the actual acting. And these past few months, the movement has suffered some serious blows, thanks to the much changed picture in the United States, where the administration has gone from sensible to absolute madness, resulting in the disintegration of various net zero alliances and a sudden shift toward treating net zero as if it's a dirty word. So how do we move forward amid all this chaos? Today, we'll hear from a range of business leaders and investors discussing their plans and priorities amid this shifting sustainability landscape. On behalf of the Globe and Mail, I'd like to recognize the World Wildlife Fund of Canada and Aviva Canada for sponsoring today's event. And on that note, I'd like to welcome Pascal Dessureau from Aviva Canada to the stage.
Thank you very much, everyone. Glad to be here, and good afternoon, and really want to thank the Globe and Mail for this event today. Are we starting with the first panel with WWF and everyone else, or?
No.
No, great.
We're starting with
Just
Sustainalytics.
Sustainalytics, excellent. So really great pleasure to be here today. Sustainable finance means a lot to us at Aviva Canada, and so is biodiversity loss and the role that nature plays in society. So we'll be glad to make some more detailed remarks this afternoon about this later on in the programming, but for now, really welcome everyone on behalf of Aviva Canada. We're glad to be sponsoring this with our partners at WWF Canada. Thank you.
It's always a sure bet. You can see insurers coming out to support movement on climate change. They first rang the bell back in the 70s. Thank you, Pascal. As I mentioned, major corporations across Canada and around the world-ish are withdrawing from net zero initiatives, yet proponents point to climate action as the key to Canada's competitiveness, particularly as we move away from the US and toward greater trade with Europe. Joining me to take stock of what's happening on the net zero front and to discuss where it might be headed is Alex Osborne-Saponia, Director of ESG Research and Methodology for Morningstar Sustainalytics. Gracefully get myself onto this incredibly high stool. I feel like a child over here. My white socks. Okay. So thank you so much for joining us, Alex. So let's just start with sort of an overview. What does the quest for net zero actually mean? Why is it so important a metric that Sustainalytics has introduced the low carbon transition rating to measure it?
Okay, so first of all, when we talk about net zero, it's not a buzzword, it's not arbitrary. It's a scientific fact that we have to achieve net zero emissions that limits warming to 1.5 degrees by 2050. We have to do this to avoid catastrophic climate change and the irreversible impacts of climate change. If we meet 1.5, there's hope we can reverse what we're seeing, both in the environment and potentially in the economy, right? So the pathway to 1.5 requires deep decarbonization through mitigation. So we need to stop emissions, through the reduction of emissions, and through the absorption or sequestration of emissions. So that's through nature-based solutions, which Canada is really well placed to facilitate, and technological solutions as well. again, Canada's really in a good place to facilitate and lead on that. So when we talk about decarbonization and 1.5, we're talking about this deep trajectory here in the pink. There may not seem a lot of difference between 1.5 and 2.5 and 3.1 when you look at the numbers, but actually the impact on the environment and the economy is devastating, okay? So, okay. Under a 1.5 degree economy, we will still see ecological and biodiversity decline. We'll be unable to produce food, access resources, and transport those resources in the way that we do now. And under 2 degrees, that's even worse, okay? And for Canada, that means a decline in their economy, in our economy. I'm Canadian now, okay? So currently, this year, we're expected to see $25 billion slashed off of our GDP due to climate impacts only, okay? And as we go through to 2050, mid-century, under a low emission scenario of 1.5, that's expected to increase. And to 2050, under a high emission scenario, it increases even further. That's not a situation Canada can afford to be in, right? But there's hope, okay? Canada is the 4th largest producer of renewable energy in the world. That's not just for electricity generation, but also primary energy generation. So we're displacing oil and gas, fossil fuels, using renewable energy, okay? We're well placed, like I said, with nature-based solutions, with knowledge that enables those nature-based solutions to be deployed as intended through Indigenous-led initiatives. So whilst climate catastrophe is on the cards, it's also not. And Canada's well placed to ensure that the globe, not just Canada, isn't.
So say that again, 4th largest producer?
4th largest producer of renewable energy. So on average, 30% of energy is renewable. Canada's at 70% currently.
Interesting. I hope Alberta is listening, just generally. So we'll get back to talking about some of the data in a couple of minutes, but we've seen this fairly abrupt backlash against net zero since Trump re-entered the picture. So can you sort of give us a brief overview of what's happening in the world?
Yeah, sure. So we've seen corporates remove themselves from net zero frameworks and target-related initiatives. Some of that might be political, but some of it isn't. So we see a lot of non-financial institutions, first of all, remove themselves from some frameworks because they set such enormous Scope 3 targets that they found that they couldn't meet them. It seems somewhat counterintuitive, but understanding Scope 3, understanding value chain emissions is really, really important. It's not okay to just take a shot in the dark and say, oh yeah, we're going to slash this by 70%, and then find out that you can't do that. So in some ways, it's kind of smart to do that and take a look at this in the way that is meaningful, right? And then we see financial institutions that remove themselves from some of these frameworks. And again, that's not necessarily for political reasons. We're seeing a lot of voluntary reporting move to mandatory reporting. A lot of these frameworks require duplication, triplication of that type of climate reporting. Therefore, some of these removals are because the reporting burden is getting too high. What we do see is targets are still in place. Funding is still in place. Sustainable finance is still there for now. There's nothing in our data that currently shows that there's a removal away from the ambition, but maybe what we're seeing is potentially going forward is some of this green hushing, so we see less shouting about net zero ambition.
And I mean, talk a little bit about how the climate, political climate is affecting that.
Honestly, I keep on being asked this question, and we aren't seeing that much change in our data so far. So we don't currently have a true picture of reporting for this year, which will show us whether there's been an impact or not. But targets remain in place. Between 2023 and 2024, we saw an increase in reporting, especially for Canadian corporates. So right now, my expectation is that maybe we'll see a dilution of how much net zero is marketed, but I don't expect to see this move away from the reporting that's currently in place.
I do feel like, I don't know if anybody saw our May cover on the DEI backlash, but it feels a lot like the same thing, right? It's a little bit of a purging of that kind of terminology from the public kind of books, but the work continues behind the scenes, which is comforting.
And that's what I expect to see. I wish I had a crystal ball and I could tell you, but our 2025 data will be the proof in the pudding, right? We'll see what's really happening.
Yeah, I did find it interesting. One company got in touch with us and was like, "We don't want to be included in the reporting because they've purged all mention of net zero from their books," which I thought was really, really fascinating. It was quite a bold email to send to a journalistic institution. I found it quite odd, I will say. So, what does all this mean for Canada? Where do we stand in terms of, net zero action?
Okay, so
dig in. We're getting to slides.
So our low carbon transition rating is Morningstar Sustainalytics flagship rating for assessing low carbon transition of over 13,000 companies, of which 300 are Canadian corporates. The top 30 Canadian corporates are in the top 5% of net zero alignment in the world. That doesn't mean they're going to meet net zero, but they're doing all the right things, they're reporting on the right things, and they're tracking the right things. But what I will say is our LCTR, we'll call it, is essentially a implied temperature rise signal at the top level that describes and shows if all companies acted in the same way as this company, this is how much the world would warm. So if we look at all Canadian corporates, the world would warm by 2.6 degrees. And you can see up here what that means to the Canadian economy, okay? But the top corporates are at 2.2 degrees, right? And on average, our global universe is 2.4. So we have corporate leaders here in Canada who are doing the right things. They're reducing emissions at a faster rate than the top leaders in other jurisdictions. Also, Canadian corporates are really good at setting targets. Now, only 32% of Canadian corporates set a target, but that's higher than the rest of the world. It's higher than what's trending right now. So not everybody is setting a target. Canada's leading in their target setting. And mining companies, Canadian mining companies, have some of the most ambitious targets in the world. That's really important because they're going to play a part in the low carbon transition and a transition to net zero.
Right. And what are some of the other leading jurisdictions, if you know off the top of your head?
Europe.
Europe, yeah.
Southeast Asia and Europe, essentially, the leading jurisdictions. Canada's just behind.
Right.
Okay.
So did you want to walk us through some of the rest of what your data is telling you, trends and so on?
So net zero preparedness, this is based off our management score. Our management score is a score between 0 and 100 and assesses over 85 metrics and indicators to determine how well prepared a corporate is to meet net zero in 2050. So as you can see here, Canadian corporates, North America, and the global average is around 45. So that's average performance. That means these corporates aren't doing enough to even reduce their emissions a little bit, let alone reduce their emissions to be aligned to net zero. Top 30 companies, Canada, average score of 60. Okay, so that means they're disclosing the right things, they're taking action in places. They're not going to meet net zero with the current practices in place, but they're doing what they need and they're reporting on their material climate change impacts, I would say right now. And then if we look at net zero disclosure sufficiency, this is a percentage indicator of how well companies are reporting against what we expect them to against, say, what was TCFD, now ISSB. So again, Canadian corporates slightly higher than the rest of the world. The top performers in Canada surpass everybody. So they're reporting on the majority of the things that they should be reporting on that allow us to start to assess material climate risk. However, we see this trend globally, okay? So regardless of the jurisdiction, regardless of the sector they're in, net zero governance and net zero metrics and targets are really well reported on. So again, Canadian leaders are reporting on these things better than others, but essentially what we aren't seeing is that reporting on net zero risk management. So if those risks have been quantified, if scenario analysis has been conducted to understand the impact on the business in the future, so taking that long-term view, and then they're not reporting on net zero strategy. And that means they're not costing plans to meet net zero and not taking the initiatives required to get to net zero in that long term. And that's because we're all quite short-sighted when it comes to business planning. We're not looking past the next 5 years, right? We need to go beyond that. And that's where this value at risk metric comes in. So a value at risk metric, it's presented as a percentage here, but it's actually the dollar value, which demonstrates how net zero will impact a company. So here it's essentially showing that 10% of top Canadian corporates will have 10% of their value wiped off between now and 2050 if they don't reduce their emissions in a more meaningful way. And essentially that links, controversially, to carbon policy. What does that mean? It means carbon pricing. And essentially it's higher for Canadian corporates than the rest of the world because the scenario we're assessing this against, which is the applied policy response, is required policy response, which does require hard, fast decarbonization with a very high carbon price. It means we can't do business with other jurisdictions like Europe, for example, because they'll slap a carbon border adjustment mechanism on anything from Canada where a carbon price isn't applied. So that's why you see this high price, this high value at risk right now. But that doesn't mean this will actually happen. It's just a projection of what will happen if things continue in this way.
Right. I mean, some of those companies are producers of fossil fuel
Exactly, yeah.
power. So I would say probably 10% would be conservative for some of them.
Well, it's an average, right?
Yeah.
And we see an average of 17% for corporates. And like I say, it's the nature of the Canadian economy. It's built on natural resources. It's built off fossil fuel energy, and it's built off the funding of those as well, right? So that's why we're seeing these higher value at risk figures.
Interesting. So, you say that this is more of a North American phenomenon, what's happening right now. So can you give us a bit of a picture of what's happening in Europe and why they are farther ahead?
It is and it isn't, right? So even in Europe, we've seen this rollback of mandatory reporting. So CSRD has been paused a couple of times. And again, it's not political, it's due to a reporting overload. So there's a lot of factors in play when we come to this, and I think some of it is quite sensationalized. But if you can't tell from my accent, I spend a lot of time in Europe, and I grew up, and I've worked with European companies in the past. And essentially, like, mandatory greenhouse gas reporting has been in place for well over 10 years. Scope 3 reporting is quite evolved. So the European market's used to reporting on some of these, both in terms of kind of like what we would see at the UK, in Germany, in the Netherlands. They have their own reporting frameworks, but they also have a well-established emissions trading mechanism and a really high carbon price in place. And they've used that as intended. They have, they've got a price on their emissions, and as a result, they've changed their behavior to avoid paying that price. So that's where we see the difference, is that Europe's just a leader because of the things that they've implemented previously. And we also see them shifting to low carbon energy. Not all of it is because of the climate crisis. There's also other geopolitical crises that have pushed them that way. But essentially, a lower carbon energy infrastructure makes costs lower for everybody as well. So they're going to benefit from that, right?
So, I mean, what would you like to see here in terms of pushing sort of this forward here in Canada?
Okay. So, like I said, Canada is well placed, right, to meet a net zero economy. It seems really far away right now, and I know it can seem, almost sad in some ways with what we see down south. But Canada's a leader, right? we already see that the top 5% of companies in the world that are making progress are Canadian companies. That's pretty cool, right? That's great. Also, Canada's well-placed to be part of, support, facilitate, and lead in net zero. So yeah, more reporting would be great. And I encourage all investors to engage with Canadian securities administrators to make reporting mandatory. Comparable data is important so we can understand what's going on, so we can understand who's truly leading the charge. But also investors should be looking at this data, looking at our data, looking at ESG data to determine who's doing what and what more they can do, okay? So engaging with those companies, right? Using stewardship and engagement services to say, hey, this is really cool. If you do this, this, and this, it would be even better, right? And then finally, this isn't business as usual. We need new, innovative financing. Canada's well-placed for this, right? We see what we do and we don't like in Europe. We can replicate, make it fit for purpose over here, right? So green bonds, transition bonds, nature-based bonds, by using, second-party opinions to understand if these are contextual, by adding in, layers of what's important to Canada, whether we want to invest in indigenous-led, nature-based solutions, if you want to assess a company who may be an oil and gas company, but is well-placed to build and transport blue and green hydrogen. The oil and gas sector, whether we like it or not, actually have a huge part to play. And that's not about getting rid of it. It's about evolving and creating a new business model that's fit for a low-carbon Canadian economy.
Right. We just have a couple of minutes. Does anybody have any questions out there?
Where do you see nuclear fitting in terms of a solution, especially in light of the, fuel and waste and where we bury it?
If we can build new nuclear reactors in a short space of time to meet 2050, then I think it has a part to play. I don't think that it's something that we should move away from, but I don't think it's necessarily part of a fair and just transition for the reasons that you just said. There's a waste issue, but there's also a cost issue as well. It's incredibly expensive to implement nuclear when the renewable alternatives are cheaper and they're faster to implement.
Go ahead.
What do you see the impact of political narratives, especially, of course, we're used to ESG and sustainability being under attack recently, but what about net zero now as well in the UK? So how do you see that impeding progress?
I think the politicizing these topics is fine, but actually net zero and ESG gives corporates a license to operate. They won't be operating under a 2-degree or a 3-degree scenario. And if you want to deny the science and politicize that, then fine. But these are facts, these are science. This isn't a political issue. I've been working in this industry for a long time, and it ebbs and flows in terms of 1 minute it's the hot topic and the next it isn't, but it never goes away. And the people in the organizations who care about this issue maintain that we continue to manage, report, and make change.
It is highly unfortunate we have a president who doesn't believe in science. Go ahead.
In addition to bragging rights due to the obviously superior performance for Canadian corporations, both the leaders and the corporates, do you see this as an opportunity for an economic opportunity for expansion of our expertise, whether it's in diagnostics, analytics, teaching, training, in other jurisdictions, a new export industry?
Absolutely. Canada can be a leader in net zero economy, and I think it's time that we put our head above the parapet and commit to it.
Okay. That's a great note to leave it on, and we are at time. So thank you so much. everybody, I'm back. I am such a space kid. It's Monday. It's Monday. My script is like, okay, it looks like we are out of time. Alex, thank you so much for joining us today. I'd now like to welcome my colleague, James Bradshaw, to the stage. I'm so sorry, James.
Thanks for that kind introduction, Don. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. I'm James Bradshaw. I'm the institutional investing reporter here at the Globe and Mail. I'm really happy to have you all here and that we got this corner office on a sunny day, which is really nice. We will jump in quickly here. I'll just invite my two panelists up to the stage to join me. So sitting nearest to me is Faith Seguir. She's Senior Vice President and Head of Sustainability Marketing and Client Experience at Mackenzie. Hi, Faith. And just on the other side is Roger Beauchemin, President and Chief Executive Officer of Addenda Capital. Thank you, Roger, for being here. Thanks you both. It's really good to have you. Just to quickly set the table, why don't we start by having each of you just give us 2 minutes about yourselves as it relates to this conversation so that everybody's clear on sort of where you're coming from, and we'll go from there.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for making the time, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to speak. So I work for Mackenzie Investments. Mackenzie's a 16 multi-boutique investment firm. We manage about just over $200 billion in assets globally. And I took the role to further build out sustainability in 2019, before it was a hot topic. And then I was excited when it became a hot topic. And so now we're facing some challenges, which I know we'll talk about. But I tell all my colleagues, especially our investment division and our CIOs, that I'm ready for a good fight.
Good afternoon, everyone. Roger Beauchemin. Alors, très heureux de vous voir. At Addenda Capital, we're an investment manager, really typical sort of institutional focused investment manager. We run $40 billion of client assets, but the way we look at it, we touch about 1.5 million Canadian families. And it's their assets that we look after, whether they be assets that are for an insurance premium that they pay for coverage, or it's a pension benefit at some point, or it's a small amount in an investment fund, through, like with Mackenzie, actually. So from that perspective, we have been involved for a while. From an ESG perspective, because we have our parent is Cooperators, it's a financial services cooperative, and in there is mostly property casualty is our biggest focus. And so we are the other canary in the coal mine, just like Aviva. The insurance companies are the ones who can tell you that that's one place where you're paying for climate change is in your physical coverage on your physical risks. I'll dig into that a bit more. I've been involved in this space for a bit, and also involved in a couple of things like I was the former chairman of the Responsible Investment Association. I sit on a number of advisory boards as well, covering sustainability.
Merci, Roger. We will come back to dig into some of that. Maybe just the best place to start, because it came up in the first panel and it's a little bit the elephant in the room for the topic today, is just what we're seeing with institutions backing out or pulling back from climate coalitions from some of the targets that had been set and generally kind of quieting down about the push towards net zero. A lot of this obviously most loudly has happened in the US, but I can think of recent examples. We've seen the CSA kind of hitting pause on requiring mandatory climate disclosure and RBC retiring. I thought that word was really doing a lot of hard work, given that they'd only been at work for a few years, retiring its sustainability targets. But for both of you, what does this signal and sort of where do we feel that we're heading from here? Maybe we can start with you, Roger, and work our way back.
Well, it's a challenging time, but I think it's a time where you've got to double down on things. So for us, our parent is a net zero asset owner, one of 4 in Canada. there's only 4 net zero asset signees, and we're an net zero asset manager. It's not our money; it's our clients' money. So we have to convince them that it's not only prudent to invest that way, but to use the capital to influence the Canadian economy. So the problem is that politics plays a very different role. We've had south of the border a very serious tort system, and we've had some unfortunate regulation in this country as well. I think that things that where the Competition Act is modified to if you state an ambition and you don't live up to it, you can get sued. So, I mean, listen, we're not living up to net zero right now. None of us. The country's not, and God knows the corporates aren't. So, but we need to change that, right? But it's okay to think that we need to get there. So that's the balance we've got to find, and I think we've got to be practical and prudent here. But this is an existential crisis, right? We have to. This is a clear and present danger, so we have to get there.
The only other thing I'll add is I do see this as a pausing and maybe a bit of a pacing. I think with, I can't speak on behalf of RBC, but I mean, all 6 of our banks pulled out of the net zero banking alliance. So that was an interesting signal for them to send. And understandably, I think what we heard from them is they just don't want to deal with any of the litigation risk out of the US. They all have big businesses and footprints there. But I do wonder, and Roger and I were having a quick side conversation before we came up, the aspiration around net zero and what 2050 brings. So we also have remained committed to our interim targets. It's a 2030 target that is constructed under the net zero investment framework. So we're comfortable with, the progress that we're making. But what does 2050 look like? Like, that just feels very aspirational. And to Roger's point, there's a big question mark whether we can get there. And this concept where we're focusing so much of our conversations around mitigation, I think at some point we'll need to start thinking about how do we live in a 2.5, potentially a more, right, degree environment, and how do the companies we're invested in, how are they able to adapt? So I hope it's a pacing, and you use the word more practical. I think that's really important. I think companies and CEOs, certainly Roger sounds like he is as well, like they're getting anxious. Can we actually meet these? Can we put these big statements out there without having a very detailed plan to back it up?
Yeah, I think we have to call a couple of things out. Firstly, the importance of it is indisputable. Like, if you ask any of my PMs and analysts whether they want portfolio managers and analysts, whether they'll go tools down on using ESG materiality research or a better understanding, they're not going to stop. I mean, it's a better way to invest assets. Secondly, it's a huge problem for Canada. Net zero means a completely different thing for Canada than most other economies, because we're so extractive and we're so energy intensive in our economy. So we start from a brown economy. So it's, green's great, but let's clean up the brown first. And let's not pick off on our either politically or our provinces or our cities or our economies. Every local community is different, and we shouldn't blame anyone for what it is. We just have to get to another place in the future and use capital to drive that through. So there's huge opportunities here. And back on engagement. So Client Engagement Canada, we started that, I think, and a lot of investors are there because the way we have to change things is very different. Our economy, it means a lot of challenges, and also from our geography. Like, the reality is, we're changing our temperature at twice the speed of other countries. So there's lots of things going on in that piece. So we have to be very careful.
That's encouraging about your PMs. And I'll just say really quickly, because both of you brought up litigation and legal aspects. From some of the reporting I did, that was one of the really big concerns for the Canadian banks, even when they were signing on, was the general counsels were very much there in the room. So what the legal framework is going to be going forward seems like it's really important. I'll just ask quickly, there was a term that came up in the first presentation, and Roger used it with me as well as we were talking before this, which was green hushing, and this notion that even where things may still be moving forward and happening, people are talking a lot more quietly. And I'm just wondering, I'd like to get both your perspectives. Does it matter whether companies and investors who do a lot of engagement with them and who have voting rights, does it matter whether they're talking about this loudly out in the world or quietly inside a boardroom behind closed doors? Is that going to shape where we go ultimately?
All right. Okay. Well, firstly, it is definitely going on. In fact, some of the institutions we've talked about, I mean, nothing changes internally. They're still doing their stuff. But what they state publicly is a very different story. But there's one thing that we cannot and we have to accelerate on is disclosure. We need to get a disclosure regime. If we don't do it ourselves, or with a CSA or like a Canadian CSSB standards, we're going to fall under somebody else's disclosure regime, right? So, and since our economy is so different, let's stand up and figure out what we need to measure, right? Because we need to measure it, because we need to change and we need to get to tomorrow. And we need to drive investments into companies to help them change, right? It's not just about risks. Certainly a risk story. We spent a lot of time talking about that.
Do you want to add anything to that, or?
Maybe the reason why, if for those that don't know, that CSSB is so important is because we do need comparable, consistent, and audited data. And, you hear often that material information should be reported in the annual reporting of the financial statements of a company and that annual report they put forward. It actually is not. It's often small disclosures that are very hard to sift through and read. So it's important that we elevate that reporting. Otherwise, it's very hard for companies like ours to properly assess and price that risk into our valuation models. So I just wanted to reiterate that.
No, I'm glad you did. And I've done events similar to this before, and I feel there's a little bit of a Groundhog Day aspect in that we come back time and again and talk about taxonomy and disclosure and getting a framework in place. And I know there has been some progress, which my esteemed colleague Jeff Jones, who you're going to hear from later, has reported on a lot. But from your perspectives, where are we on that? How close to that are we getting? And are we getting close to something that is actually going to be simple and clear and usable, or is there a danger that it becomes, unwieldy and an obstacle?
I guess I can go first. And your question is specifically on mandatory disclosure standards or the taxonomy.
Yeah.
Well, I think both the disclosure standards question mark, right? The companies that will want to report and are reporting today, it's going to be status quo for the next little while until we will certainly talk a little bit later about what a Carney government might do. I do want to call out another risk with us not reporting. Do you mind if I go off? I should have mentioned it in our last comment. The other value from reporting is consumer behavior. We have to change our habits, especially in developed markets. We love big things. We love lots of things. I'll say something a little provocative. I actually think I was saying on our prep call, I think President Trump might be a closet climate activist. Imagine he comes out and says, maybe kids don't need $30. Maybe they only need $2. He's promoting EVs, whether you like, I choose not to buy Tesla for a number of reasons. But he's promoting EVs on the front lawn of the White House. That's not such a bad thing, maybe, right? But I think the challenge with a lack of reporting, or the previous question on green hushing or us not talking about this, is people won't know. Canadians won't know what their options are. They won't know what trade-offs they're making. The Climate Change Committee in the UK, they're further along, right? They're not extractive, and they've had to move faster than we certainly have felt the urgency to. But in the UK, they've done research to say 60% of our net zero targets can be achieved through behavior change. And that's a change in technology adoption, whether you're thinking EVs or other aspects and appliances in your home. And then there's a lifestyle change, walking, taking your bike, right, not driving. So there's a number of things that reporting helps to bring forward, and if we all stay quiet, then it's not going to move us forward. On the taxonomy, Roger, I'll let Roger, since I took a little bit more, I'll let Roger answer that one because he's probably got a better update.
Yeah, thanks. But this is about using for us as investors, it's about using capital, right, to make changes in the real economy. This is, ultimately we're allocating capital to get returns. And so what we know is Canada, the Institute for Sustainable Finance at Queen's put out a report in 2020. It was really great because it framed it very nicely. The 3 top sectors we need that are greenhouse gas emissions were oil and gas, so both production but also power generation. There was then transportation, and then the built environment. When you think about it, the built environment, if you invest in a building to make it more energy efficient and less, it actually goes up in value, right? So it's not all about costs, but the thing is, it's about using markets to make investments into Canada. We figure we need at least $25 billion invested into Canada every year to get to the net zero economy. So what do we need for that? We need a framework. Investors need price signals, and then they need rules of engagement, sort of a rules of a game, right? And you change those, which is what we're doing now south of the border. We're changing both those. We're changing price signals, and so it's going to stop capital flow. But if you've got good capital flow, capital doesn't solve anything, right? But it increases the speed or decreases the speed. So that's what we need. In order to do that, you need a framework. We've called it a taxonomy. People don't like that word. I don't either, because people don't understand what it is. It's a framework to get investors from across the world to understand what makes a good investment from a net zero perspective, science-based, in Canada. If you're in some other place, you don't really know exactly. So that framework just helps drive capital to the right places, and we need that capital. Those are investments into our country, into our economy, to help us get better.
And that's a great place to come back to you, Fate, because leading up to this event, we were talking about ESG and net zero initiatives being actually rooted in really strong fundamentals that are essential and vital to the Canadian economy. Can you tell us a bit more about what's going on sometimes behind the scenes in terms of engagement, in terms of voting practices, in terms of the work that's being done to reinforce that case about economic fundamentals to people and make sure that that becomes the driving force here?
Absolutely. I don't know if Rogers, I don't know many of your PMs, and I don't know if you know portfolio managers. They're brilliant people, and I love our PMs, I think we've got 25 of them. But they're contrarians, and it's a lot of work to convince them to change their process, right? And many of them have, 20, 25 years of experience. So the whole concept of, they always paid attention to materiality and company culture, and the G in ESG was always core to what we do. The E and the S are, I'd say, 10, 15 years is when these started to hit their radar. So we spend a lot of time with them making sure that we're translating the data. And we actually use, I can't see Alex, but we use Sustainalytics, we'll use MSCI, we do our own research, we use Bloomberg as well as part of our research. And what we do there is we're running scenario analysis to understand, 5 to 10 years from now. The other thing I'll mention is we're not short-term investors. Our investment teams are not turning over names every day. And so if you're investing in a company for 5, 10, 15 years, if you're investing essentially in the Canadian economy, then you need to make sure that you understand that risk and you're pricing that risk and changing your discount rates accordingly. So that's something that, that continues to happen. And so our team will do quite a bit of work on sectors that we deem are at risk, names that we deem are at risk. We've actually prioritized. One of the reasons that we got or the primary driver of us getting approval and getting our board and our CEOs comfortable with aligning to a net zero interim target was because we were able to look and see that 100 names contributed to about 70% of our financed emissions. And I have an accounting background. I love simple numbers because it's like a soundbite and everyone can get behind it. But that means then you take that, we built an engagement program around it. We start engagements by saying, well, company so-and-so, you are part of our program, which means your emissions are now my problem and we have to solve them. And it became a very practical way for us to address that. Now, there is some, I'll talk to proxy voting as well, because that's been where companies are not working with us if we're not seeing progress being made, which these are not contentious meetings. We're an investor, we're an advisor, especially if we don't have one of our PMs with us. We don't go in saying, you know, I'm going to reallocate capital. That's certainly not my team's role. But we do advise on what's happening in Europe, what's happening in other jurisdictions that can help inform their strategy and help us to influence what they do next. Where we're not seeing progress over 18 to 24 months, we'll take it to a proxy vote and we'll support. We don't generally file shareholder proposals ourselves, but we know a number of the organizations that do file. We'll go in and we'll support those. Now that's another thing in the U.S. They actually implemented more rules around supporting shareholder proposals. So now we're very cautious, especially those duly listed Canadian companies are getting us, they're on our watch list now. So tons of things there, but we're very, very mindful of where there's litigation risk for us.
Yeah. That's great. Roger, just to come back to you, I mean, you talked earlier about Addenda Capital being part of the cooperators group, and you've talked about insurance companies being the canary in the coal mine. So can you speak briefly to what are the business risks that you're seeing if we don't start to move on this? There was one terrific example around housing that you gave me when we spoke ahead of time, and we'll also get a little bit to the opportunities too, because there are two sides to that coin.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's physical risks are in a way understandable, but so we partnered our climate hazards and advanced research modeling team, our CHARM team as we call them, combined with the Canadian Climate Institute, and so they came up with the simple figure that if you take buildings that are going to be built between now. They're not built yet, but the ones we're going to build between now and 2030, $8 billion worth of that, it's not built yet, $8 billion worth of that will be damaged or will be need to be refixed between now and 2030. So we haven't built it yet, it's going to be destroyed, or at least severely. So that's what we have to get in our minds. So this is stuff's going on. So adaptation is a really, really critical issue from now on. Right, so the climate risk is already priced in. It's already happening, no matter what speed we go at. But the reality is, we need to make Canadians and communities better adapted to the climate change that's already there, on top of abating the situation for the future as well.
And if I'm right, when we look at rising insurance costs, not all of that is being attributed to climate risk, but some of it certainly is, correct?
Yeah, exactly. So, here we've all got to be prudent as well. So we see you see a lot of research showing that the payouts on claims is going up at an asymptotic rate right now in pretty well all geographies. But listen, from a Canadian perspective, we looked at least the experience that we did. And we have a couple of factors. It's not all due to climate change, so don't think that's it. First of all, there's inflation. Like all our homes are worth more than they used to be, right? So that's a big factor. Secondly, is there's more insurance products out there, more coverage in general. So that's part of the increase in claims. But there's about a third that's unexplained, and the third is unexplained. So it kind of fits it. It's due to the severity and frequency of weather-related events.
That's great. A question for both of you. In terms of, I'd love to get a sense of what you're seeing in terms of where capital is flowing in this space. And as I've covered it, I've seen some fairly high-profile examples of investment in transition funds. The really big one would probably be the Brookfield transition funds that were launched in recent years, but there are other really good ones as well. Where are we in terms of momentum right now for capital flowing in those directions and being allocated to those types of things? Because as you talked about, Roger, it's about velocity. It can speed things up or it can slow it down. And so it matters very much, what kind of momentum we have in terms of where capital is moving on this topic. Do you want to tell us what you're seeing, Fate? Or?
I mean, and one thing right now with the yo-yo situation is a lot of stuff has stopped altogether south of the border. Some days it's on, some days it's off. So sadly, a lot of projects are down. But the reality is, from an intent perspective, more and more asset owners are interested in here because there's a huge business opportunity. They get it. The reality is that renewables and on that energy front are becoming, they're replacing the incumbents, and that's why we need to have the Canadian experience, fit for purpose here. We need to prepare for tomorrow. We can't look at the last 10 years from an energy perspective and think that there's not going to be a transitions going on and put our heads in the sand. So, overall, I think that there's still great returns to be had, but it's not it's not a straight situation. With when interest rates went up, you had your cost of capital went down, so a lot of renewable projects really suffered. And with pricing going down as well, you had some difficulty. So it's not going to be a straight shot, but there's a huge opportunity, and I think the good investors and the good products are still flowing pretty nicely.
I'd say the IEA reported from end of 2024, it was like 2 to 1 of investment in clean energy, renewables plus nuclear and so on, to fossil fuel projects. So that's a good sign, but I imagine we're probably going to see a slowdown this year, right? I can't imagine it'll be, we'll see the same level of increase.
So that is going to change, okay. And I should ask, we've talked a little bit about the politicization of this issue as well. We've now got a Prime Minister in Canada who has a track record in this area, who was the UN Special Envoy for Climate, who was, I think I called him the chief arm twister for bringing together the climate coalitions like GFANZ and the various subsidiaries for banks and asset managers and so on, and who was, in large part responsible for raising those 3 Brookfield transition funds, which have raised something like $30 billion and counting so far. How much of a difference does it make to have political leadership, who believes in this and has some conviction around this, particularly when we're seeing the opposite in not just the U.S., but frankly some other parts of the world as well at the moment?
Well, I mean, he gets the business, he gets capital, he gets the risk side. At the Bank of England, he gave that famous Lloyd's speech in 2015, which I think laid it out very nicely. For if you want to see a primer on why this is important, I think it's a really good spend of time. And I think he can come from a position there of strength. So, because we're going to have to bend the other way too. We're going to have to make sure that, from an Alberta perspective and from the energy that we're making now and the money we're making on that, we're use that to transition correctly. I mean, so I think we have to, as a country, we have to unite, and we have to sort of. I'm from Quebec, and I get the pipeline story, but I mean, getting oil from Venezuela on boats is really not a better option, because we got to deal with the reality of where we are today. And so we need to get to tomorrow, and we need to do that in a Canadian fashion, reaching out across the country and sorting this out. And there's huge pressures on electricity grids. I mean, electrification needs to be set up. We need to interconnect, not north-south, but we need to interconnect across provinces, and we need to build that out. And those are all the projects that, so we need to have a transition path for every industry, right? And I think this government is in a place where, having been a GFANZ player, I think it's going to be, has an opportunity to play to the other side and reach across. And we, as sustainability people, we have to be practical too.
Anything to add, Fate, or?
Just that it means everything to have, like it does. And like in the short term, he's going to have, obviously he's balancing a lot of challenges, the economy in this country, refueling that. I hate using that word, but yeah, it's, I think it's going to make a big difference in the long run.
Okay. We're down to our last couple of minutes. I'll see if I can throw it open for a question before we end, but I'd like not to leave here without talking about the importance of Indigenous partnerships and, both why they're essential for getting projects started and done, but also what we can learn from Indigenous peoples as we go through this process.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you raised that, because I was going to go there, but it's such a critical element. If we look at the electrification work that we need to do, if we look at even all the minerals we need to find, we need to have a respect of prior and informed consent. We need to have the Indigenous nations as partners in a fully Canadian way to the projects. And I think we have this opportunity now. And also, we have to recognize that these projects and this opportunity is to flow economics into First Nations and to really get reconciliation up and running. And I think that if we do that properly, we can not only get projects done very quickly, but also we can use the knowledge of the areas of, a lot of these, how to get there. Don't go here, go there. Respect the environment as we do that. There's a lot of wisdom there, and we need to tap in, and we need to be partners. And I think this is a huge opportunity, and I'm excited about it, actually.
Last word to you.
The only thing I'll add, yes to everything Roger has stated, and there's a cost associated if you don't get consent. And, we've been using a use case of just comparing, the Enbridge partnership agreement to that of the coastal pipeline, and just the cost differential was like 8-1 or something like that. So there is a cost. So as you think about, fiduciary and investments and numbers, that's a number that investment managers can hold on to and then build into their process. So absolutely.
Thank you so much. The shot clock's run down, so I'm not going to throw it open to questions, but please buttonhole us if you do want to ask anything before anybody scoots out. Thank you both so much for joining us, Fate and Roger. We really, really appreciate this. And we now are going to have, I believe, a 20-minute networking break. So we'll see you all back here about 2:20. 2:20.
Hi, folks. Well, welcome back, everyone. I'm Jeff Jones. I cover ESG and sustainable finance for the Globe and Mail. And I'm looking forward to moderating these next two discussions. First of all, we're going to explore leadership in net zero programs. And this, as you know, is a tough time for that. Economic uncertainty caused by the Trump tariffs, a backlash against ESG in general, at least in the United States, and shifting goalposts on the regulatory front. And of course, none of that changes the imperative of dealing with the crisis of climate change. Companies face a lot of risks there, from government policy to investor demands we heard about just a little bit earlier, to the threat of physical damage from fires, floods, and the like. So let's break this game of 3D chess down with our experts. I'd like to welcome Lauren O'Malley, who is Senior Advisor of Sustainability for Aecon Group, and joining us virtually, Gabe Smith, Vice President of Global Sustainability Business for Schneider Electric. Let's welcome them to the stage. Well, thanks to you both for being here. Why don't we start actually with the State of the Union? Net zero plans had a steep rise in number and sophistication over really a very, very short period of time. So how is the corporate world navigating this now? Lauren, I'll start with you. Why don't you give us an idea of how Aecon and the construction sector in general sees these things?
Yeah, we have always considered decarbonization to be critical. When I first joined, we had targets set that were very much internally developed. We were working as a part of our legal team, very much derived from a sort of regulatory kind of compliance landscape. And it has really evolved over the past few years. And now we have been really turning to what is best practice, looking at science-based targets, aligning with all of those best practices, achieving that 1.5 trajectory, and I think that for construction in specific and for many industries in which the supply chain is very diverse, the key area that we are now turning to is that scope 3. And how do we work with our supply chain? For us, it's our suppliers. How do we work with them to achieve what is net zero? We've figured out that path internally. We've identified those key levers for direct emissions and decarbonization in those areas, but what those critical areas are going to be is for how we engage with those suppliers and work with them to achieve that pathway to net zero.
I mean, scope 3 is most of the game for Aecon, is it not?
It really is. It's a large majority of our emissions for sure.
Gabe, same to you. Schneider Electric is a global organization with operations and clients everywhere, all with a focus on sustainability. Where do things sit in your world vis-a-vis net zero?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's great to be with you all. Jeff and Lauren, it's an honor to be on this panel with you. I would echo a lot, Lauren, of what you said, and we'll come back to scope 3 because I think that's a very important topic in this conversation. For those of you that may not be as familiar with Schneider Electric, we are a leader in digital transformation of energy management and automation. We do have facilities all over the world. We have been active in sustainability, net zero, carbon neutrality for a very long time. This is not new to us. We have been named the world's most sustainable company in 2025 by Time Magazine as well as Corporate Knights. And we're actually the only company to be ranked by Corporate Knights Global 100 2 times. So we're proud of that, but I would say that for us, it's not about the accolades, it's not about the awards. Sustainability for us at Schneider Electric is at the heart of our business practice of what we do. It really is ingrained in everything permeating through strategy as a business. So to that effect, Jeff, when you ask about what impact do all of the current developments have on us, it certainly has an impact. I'm not saying there's no impact, but our mission remains unchanged. And that's very important to our employees, to our customers, to our shareholders. As an impact company, it's more than just a corporate goal. It's a driving force that shapes our business decisions and inspires our employees. And Lauren, coming back to what you said, our journey has really brought us to a lot of activity, particularly recently around our scope 3 and engaging our top 1,000 suppliers and not just tracking and measuring data for our scope 3 inventory, but also educating, empowering, putting together consortiums to help our suppliers decarbonize. Many of our suppliers cannot do the type of progress that we need them to do on their own. So we have a lot of years of history now partnering with our suppliers to help them actually implement projects that help them achieve progress on their own and certainly will help our scope 3 as well. So I just would echo that comment. It's a really big factor for all companies right now is that scope 3, which is a big portion of our overall GHG emissions as well.
Okay, well now in Canada, of course, we heard earlier there's been a backslide on the regulatory front in disclosure requirements as related to the CSA, which last month pausing work toward making climate disclosure mandatory in this country. And it followed the SEC in the United States, which abandoned mandated disclosure on emissions brought in under the previous administration. So where does this leave companies, Lauren, that were working towards this?
Yeah, I think it's important to tease apart action and regulatory disclosures. I think that we have been fortunate to see some amazing initiatives and innovations that have been driven by a framework that's been led of, I guess, completely voluntary action. And I think that those companies are the ones that recognize the value add of considering sustainability, whether that's internally for opportunities and risks, but also based on stakeholders and their evaluation of sustainability initiatives. And I think that those companies will continue to lead the way. Alex spoke to that earlier as well. And I think that the big area where we're going to start to see the implications of a lack of a regulation would be in the companies that don't have the existing resources, the existing capacity internally. And that's what regulation does, is it kind of creates that accountability for those companies. So where we're going to see, and I sort of going back to that scope 3 point, is the companies that are taking action, they're doing that directly, but they're also trying to encourage their supply chain. And any of those individual companies that don't have that internal initiative, that capacity, and they aren't required by regulation, it's going to require a little bit more push for them to get on board. And that's where I see that the biggest issue is going to be caused with that lack of regulation. But I also want to touch on the point of, I guess, reputational impact. And when we have these leading companies in these groups, in these industries that are paving the way and taking these voluntary initiatives that are significant, it does have an impact on peer companies as well that are trying to follow suit and sort of stay matching up with these leading companies. So it's going to be interesting to see what that end result is going to be. And I believe that those leaders are doing some really great things, and they will hopefully continue to do so. And the implications, again, as I said, is going to be on how that scope 3 is going to look like. And it's really going to be up to those companies to push their supply chain and not necessarily rely exclusively on required regulatory disclosures.
Well, Gabe, I'd really like to get your perspective on this.
Yeah, without the delays with the CSA and the SEC, and we're seeing this across the globe as well with CSRD starting to question some of the timing and scale and scope of their disclosure requirements. It definitely does have an impact. The level of impact depends on what company that you're talking about. Without standardized disclosures, it's difficult to benchmark progress, to create that accountability like Lauren talked about. And there's really a need for national level mandates for consistency, for accountability, for efficiency across businesses. Now, the way this will play out, again, Schneider Electric, we have our own example. I do see this across many other very large commercial industrial end users that we partner with and work with as well. I think, Lauren, you talked about the reputational risk or the moral suasion that is out there through investor pressure, consumer expectations, reputational concerns, as was described. Those are effective, and they can continue to still be effective in the environment that we find ourselves in, especially for large companies. However, it tends to be less effective. That type of pressure tends to not have the same level of impact and urgency for smaller firms. Lauren, you mentioned the resources, right? That the lack thereof. And those are many of the suppliers within our very large supply chain where there's limited resources or expertise. So as we know, those small to medium-sized businesses are critical to affecting change throughout the value chain. So what I've been, maybe one point of practical advice on this topic is as we work with 2,000 or more other commercial and industrial end users to help them along their journey, I encourage companies to see this as not a halt, but a pause that allows them to take the right measurements and the right benchmarking of data, because the reality is to do this right, it does take a little bit of time. So use this time to your advantage, but do not stop progress. That seems to be resonating with a lot of companies right now. And again, large companies like Schneider, we're continuing the same journey that we've been on with truly the same level of pace and urgency that we've had before.
Well, Gabe, I mean, we heard at the top of this presentation, Alex talking about just the scale of the problem that we're dealing with. Can voluntary measures get us there?
Not completely, no. I think voluntary measures, again, if they're not universally adopted and framed across the entire industry, it's very difficult then to benchmark results and create the accountability that we need. So to answer the question of the long-term goal, voluntary will not get us there. But in the short term, it's important for companies to take a long view of this issue and not create certainly not stop progress, because it's only going to be more difficult for those companies when policies and disclosure mandates come back to catch up to those. So now is the time to continue action, albeit in a very measured way and in a very intentional way as well, Jeff.
Well, along those same lines, here in Canada, Bill C-59, the anti-greenwashing legislation, is being criticized by folks who think it has the potential to make companies fearful of penalties, even if they are making a legitimate effort. And in the US, there's a 180-degree change in policy and attitude towards ESG in general, certainly at the administration level. And this panel is about leadership.
Yes.
So who's setting the tone for a company's disclosure? Is it the sustainability department, or is it legal? Maybe I can get you to weigh in on that, Lauren.
Yeah, for sure. I do want to say it's a combination of the two. We are seeing an increase in responsibilities from our legal department, and I think that that's a tone that we're seeing elsewhere as well. And really, the reason being is that we are seeing, of course, rise of litigation, but also increased skepticism. And I think that there needs to be some more caution taken. And it's created quite a bit of apprehension towards how things are being communicated. And I think what's really important is to sort of speak to what was said in the previous panel is behind the scenes, there are still many things, many actions being taken, many great initiatives, but they might not just be spoken about as loudly. And speaking from someone on sustainability team, we like to be bold. We like to take action. We like to, scream these commitments out loud. And this is where we are learning that, we need to be reserved. And this is where the legal team steps in and they really work with us to ensure that we are balancing that legal soundness and that bold strategy at the same time in order to effectively communicate what we're doing, but avoiding that risk.
Okay. Gabe, from your perspective, who sets the tone?
Increasingly, legal departments are taking the lead on ESG disclosures. That is reputational risk, that's fear, if you will, of missteps on a company's ESG claims leading to lawsuits, leading to fines or public backlash. I think that it's one very important topic when it comes to this matter is data, and communicating environmental action with measurable data is critical. Businesses really need to be focused on providing specific data-backed information right now when making environmental claims. That's the number one defense that we have, is make sure that we're not just speaking for word's sake, but really good data foundation in place. This includes aligning with established frameworks and standards like C-59, sharing regular updates on achievements, being prepared to discuss the challenges encountered along the way. Let's be honest about that. This is not easy. And by authentically communicating setbacks as well as victories, businesses can create a balanced and honest narrative that captures their total sustainability journey, which is also important. A few practical things that are helpful in this space is, again, really we encourage companies to see sustainability as a company-wide responsibility, not just the responsibility of a department. The need to ensure value-based sustainability work can continue apart from the legal aspect of the messaging and communication. As I mentioned earlier, see this as a journey. A phased-in transition plan allows businesses time to adjust, time to put the right steps in place to take the right action. And I do think that there is a fear, Jeff, as you mentioned, of companies saying, well, if we're too vocal about the action that we're taking, we don't want that to be misinterpreted, or we don't want to face criticism. It is far better, and I would say important, to be vocal right now as leaders in the space. And Lauren, I really appreciate your comment. Schneider's doing the same thing. We want to put ourselves out there and showcase the leadership, not to be braggadocious about it, but just to really say, look, we are committed to this. And as more and more companies hopefully do that, I am hopeful that we'll have more safe harbor type of language that creates space for businesses to act in good faith, right? And may need to refine claims over time. I do believe there is merit in that fear that exists that keep companies a little bit hesitant and holding back. So frameworks, governments can help with that by creating a little bit more space for companies to really communicate the action that they are taking.
Okay, well, also on the leadership front, I'd like to explore a little bit the nexus between E and G. That being the the progress that's being made in kind of companies putting their money where their mouth is, right? Tying some portion of executive pay to meeting climate-related goals. Is this an effective strategy?
I think it can be an effective strategy. I think it's a piece of the puzzle. I think that it does communicate with stakeholders, with shareholders, that this is something that is a priority. But beyond that, I think that it provides a sense of accountability and motivation for executives. And it creates an incentive for top-down action. I'm a big advocate for both top-down and bottom-up action and being able to communicate that effectively. So by setting these types of targets that are linked to executive compensation, you are encouraging these teams to use their resources effectively to encourage change. But that being said, I think that those targets need to be substantial enough for that accountability to actually take place. So I think that these targets need to be ambitious and they need to be time considerate. You need to have something that is long-term enough that you're encouraging significant change as well as on that ambition side. So, for example, targets that are linked to science-based decarbonization, that will be an effective measure. And something else I really like is the concept of leading and lagging targets. And whether that's for a company or for linking to executive compensation, what a lagging target would be something like decarbonization, and that is the result of action. But a leading target would be what the action is. So for example, that would be percentage of resources allocated to decarbonization activities. That would be renewable energy procured as a percentage. Those kinds of actions, and having those two work together to really drive that accountability, that motivation, and that change. And beyond that, I think a really important piece on that governance side is, I mentioned it's a piece of the puzzle, but really having a strong governance linked to sustainability. So at ACON, we decided to really make sure that this was embedded into our governance strategy by implementing our climate and sustainability related risks into our enterprise risk management framework. And by doing so, in all board level decisions, sustainability and climate risks that are material to us are considered at the same stage, on the same level as all other organizational risks. So I think that a piece of the puzzle for sure, but I think there's also many other levers that are involved and just as necessary as well.
So just level with hardcore finance. Okay. Well, what about beyond the C-suite, Gabe?
Yeah, if the question is it helpful? The short answer is yes. And I'll talk about the all employee aspect of this, but tying to the first question, tying executive pay to targets is a useful lever for change, but I would say only if the targets are credible and they show progress towards the goals that have been clearly defined and there's transparency in the process. It's important that those targets as well, again, are aligned with a credible framework like SBTI. With medium to long-term goals, tying this factor of linking executive pay to targets, it signals also a level of seriousness that these goals mean something to organizations. And it increases also accountability and trust throughout the organization as well as with customers and shareholders. Schneider Electric is an example. We have that in place with our executives. I think of other clients of ours like Mars, Santander, L'Oreal that all have the same type of approach. And then I think research does indicate that doing this, it helps companies adopt a longer term view of progress as opposed to being battered around by the waves of current politics, if you will, right? Having this as a firm commitment. In Schneider Electric, we have a Schneider Sustainability Index that we report out on quarterly. Our Q1 report was just released a couple of weeks ago, so that is public information. And we track our progress clearly across very defined categories. That links directly to our executive pay structure, and it also links into all 170,000 or so of our employees' bonuses as well. So a part of all of our compensation is based on our progress toward the what we call our SSI score. And that is a really important part for us of the meaningful progress that we intend to continue making in this space, not just in the short term. So parlaying that, it has to start, I believe, at the executive level, really lead by example. We're talking about leadership here. And it can really have an impact across an organization because sustainability, again, should not just be the responsibility of one department or a few. It really needs to be owned by the collective culture and the collective organization as well.
Okay, well, I found that a really stark finding in the numbers that we saw from Morningstar Sustainalytics today. I think the finding that no companies in Canada, or indeed anywhere, are yet on a path that aligns with 1.5 degrees. I think that is a little staggering. So, what do you folks see in the future of climate and sustainable finance that could start to actually bend the arc quicker towards net zero? I'm going to ask the panel this. Maybe I could start with you, Lauren.
Yeah, I think that, I spoke to it earlier, is that scope 3. I think that it depends on the industry and it becomes very specific. For us, a lot of our scope 3 emissions are linked to purchased goods and services. We are a construction company, so for example, concrete is a massive one. So for us, it's a lot of advancements in technology, it's in a lot of advancements in processes. So things like funding that's going to these areas to encourage advancements in these kind of key spaces is really critical for us. And I think that is going to play a very huge role. But there is an important role also for collaboration and education. So we're not here just sort of hoping that these kinds of levers are going to encourage our supply chain to take action, and we're sort of taking a passive role and saying, right now, we saw the trajectory, it's going to be sort of this gradual slope down, and the thing is, we're not going to sit here and wait for that. We are going to encourage and talk with our key suppliers and encourage innovation. So something that we've been working on is things like pilot projects, where we've actually worked with a few concrete companies who are just sort of cutting edge, low carbon, net zero concrete products, that they're working on these technologies, they need to bring these to the market, but before they do so, they need to test them. So we work with them as key partners so that these types of technologies, these types of materials can be brought to market sooner and really sort of aid in that decarbonization across the entire supply chain. So it depends on the industry, it depends on the company, but there are quite a few levers that are accessible for doing that and achieving that net zero.
Yeah, there's a lot of pretty innovative things going on in the concrete world. Yes. Yeah, with regard to embedded CO2 and lots of different things there. Gabe, from your perspective, what do you see as something that's going to change the game?
What you're describing is we refer to as the ambition to impact or the ambition to action gap. There's a few different studies and statistics that all kind of orient around, generally speaking, 80% of companies have set some type of goal, but only 20% or less of those companies are making meaningful, measurable progress toward achieving those goals, right? Why is that? I believe there's a lot of goals that were set, almost like the famous phrase of hope is not a strategy, right? They weren't necessarily very data-driven goals. So where does that leave us now, right? What do you do with that, right? It has never been more important than it is right now to link this topic in the language of sustainability and progress to real, measurable business results and even ROI. Those conversations need to blend together because we're talking to chief legal officers, we're talking to CFOs. How do we make meaningful progress and start to bridge that gap? We need to see the real impact of sustainability initiatives. We have a ton of data in our own operations and for our clients that really show the hard dollar savings and value from taking on-site decarbonization efforts in the right way and the right sequence that create that return and that runway to actually make progress towards our goal. In the supply chain, it's no surprise that we've come to that topic so much right in this panel because it's not just enough again to track data. Hey, suppliers, we need your data. We provide technology to our suppliers that enable them to take action, and that involves education. It involves consortiums. A good practical example of that are about a dozen or so consortiums that we've put together as Schneider Electric with our suppliers and with others in different industries like Energize in the pharmaceutical sector, where we're working with the major companies in each of those sectors to aggregate suppliers within each of their supply chains because they share suppliers. And let's do an aggregated renewable energy power purchase agreement for those suppliers. So we've been very successful at launching some of those. There's more in the pipeline. And again, this is just practical, action-oriented ways that we can enable companies to take action versus just request it or demand it. What are we doing to actually help the ecosystem make meaningful progress in these areas? So that's just a couple of examples around supply chain as well.
Well, those are some great insights, folks. Thanks so much for providing your insight and wisdom, but we're going to have to leave it there. So please join me in thanking our panelists today, Lauren and Gabe. Great job. And I'd like to welcome Pascal Desereau of Aviva Canada back to the stage.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Jeff. I'm glad to be back on stage today, and good afternoon, everyone. I first want to thank the Globe and Mail for putting this fantastic event together. It's clearly on a pressing topic, both professionally as well as personally. It's my pleasure to open this next discussion on the importance of integrating nature and biodiversity in your net zero planning. Aviva has been an advocate on this topic alongside our partner, WWF Canada, and I'd like to take this time to share with you not only why we've chosen to take action on this issue, but why we believe every business should understand and act on their exposure to their increasing risk. At Aviva, our engagement on nature has been closely tied to our exposure to climate change. It's no secret that the insurance industry is on the economic front lines of this crisis. We've heard from Brager this morning about physical risk. Well, last year our industry paid out $8.5 billion in insured losses from severe weather events. It's our worst year on record for our industry. We're seeing a rapid escalation. If you look back 40 years ago, basically the year I was born, we used to have around 20 of these events in a decade. If you're looking at today's decade, we're looking at about 138 of these events. That's massive. So ultimately, if all of this is left unchecked, this could lead to insurance becoming unattainable or unaffordable for Canadians. So as an industry really that's built on the protection of Canadians, we feel that we have a responsibility to act on behalf of both our business and our customers. So you might ask, why nature? Well, when the teams at Aviva began pulling together our net zero ambitions for 2040, which we announced in 2021, it became clear to us that we could not make meaningful progress on climate change without also acting on the loss of biodiversity and nature. These two crises are intertwined. You can't solve for one without the other. So now, is it true that you can't put a dollar value on nature? Well, we'll talk about this hopefully on the panel later on, but clearly there's a link between nature and economic value. It's been estimated that $44 trillion in economic value generation is at least moderately or highly dependent on nature. That's equivalent to about, a bit more than half of the world's GDP, just to put this in perspective. So it's massive. It's massive for all of us, clearly. The good news is that nature also generously offers us solutions to these challenges. I'll give just one example from our business. So clearly we're addressing climate change on two fronts. The first one is on decarbonization of our own business, but also we're helping Canadians become more resilient to the extreme impacts of weather events. That means building with more resilient materials, clearly, and with technology that helps us fight those impacts. But it also means protecting and investing in the built-in protections our communities receive from nature. Communities that house our businesses and our customers. It can look like restoring wetlands and riverbanks that protect our communities from floodwaters, planting trees that serve as windbreaks for our homes, or even something as simple as depaving unused urban space to allow groundwater to run off into the soil. For us, we see this as a sound investment. It delivers risk reduction and value creation. It's also been a key component of our decarbonization strategy. So I'll finish up with one more point that I feel is particularly salient given the current political climate. Most Canadians, myself included, often think of our beautiful landscapes and diverse wildlife as a treasured part of our national identity. However, these ecosystems also provide us with an abundance of riches: water that's clean and available, carbon that's captured and stored, biodiversity that pollinates our crops. And as our relationship with our neighbors to the south continues to shift, it's time to consider these wild spaces as a national asset to be protected and sustained. We as an organization want to play our part in that effort alongside our partners at WWF Canada. Now it's my pleasure to welcome back Jeff, who needs, I believe, no introduction today, to the stage to introduce our panel. Thank you, Jeff.
Well, thanks, Pascal. So as mentioned, our next conversation will explore climate and biodiversity and how the two are intrinsically linked. So take everything we talked about when we discussed climate leadership and layer on the importance of protecting the natural world. So just as on the climate front, there are a range of risks for companies, but also some pretty big opportunities. There are burgeoning efforts to take inventory of land, water, and air and track how companies affect those. Also methods of standardized disclosure that are gradually taking hold. It really is, in my view, the next frontier in sustainability. So let's get into that right now. I'd like to welcome to the stage Megan Leslie, who's President and CEO of the World Wildlife Fund Canada, and joining us virtually, Carolyn Mernigan, who is partner at Deloitte Canada, specializing in strategy, risks, and transactions, who joins us up on the screen. There she is. Okay, so for the panel here, this topic gets into a fraction of the airtime that we hear about when we discuss climate. So why don't we get our panelists to tell why that needs to change and how their experience in their organizations is helping to make that happen. Why don't I start with you, Megan?
Thank you, and thanks everyone for being here. This is such a great opportunity to have a really needed discussion, and especially, as you just said, the piece about nature maybe isn't being discussed as much as we need to. So, I mean, we're all pretty savvy to what's going on here. We know about nature-based solutions. We know that nature stores carbon. But I don't know if we all know a third of our global greenhouse gases come from the destruction of nature. So when we are cutting down those forests, obviously, but also digging up the landscape and seascape, there's carbon in the soil, there's carbon in all the green matter that we see, grasslands and wetlands. We dig it up and it converts into greenhouse gases. So the destruction of nature causes a third of our global greenhouse gas emissions. But then the opposite can also be true, right? We can actually restore nature and in the same time restore that carbon into the landscapes and seascapes. Great, so we've got a solution to climate change through nature. But I'm at the World Wildlife Fund, wildlife is our middle name, and we care a lot about what wildlife need. And as you mentioned, biodiversity loss is a huge issue, not just here in Canada, but around the world. Biodiversity is just the fancy word for the diversity of life on our planet. It's shrinking, and it is shrinking fast. So at WWF Canada, we care a lot about nature as a nature-based climate solution, but also as an opportunity to support biodiversity of life on our planet. If I can add one more thing. Because nature is a solution to biodiversity loss and climate change, it is also an incredible opportunity for us all to be just and ethical in how we do our work. And what I mean by that is we are on a journey of reconciliation with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis in Canada, in this country. And there are incredible conservation projects, restoration projects, protection projects happening all across this country that are being led by Indigenous peoples. So it's an incredible opportunity to literally put our money where our mouth is, to support that work with like whatever we've got, like communications expertise or technical expertise or lobbying efforts, whatever we have. Whatever skills and expertise we have to support that work, we can also be supporting reconciliation at the same time. So nature, there's just such an incredible opportunity to win on so many fronts.
Okay. I'll turn it over to you, Carolyn.
Great, thank you. And when we look at the opportunity to bring nature and biodiversity into the conversation, it takes many different forms depending on the business that the organization is in, because their kind of impacts and their dependencies on nature and biodiversity really differ. And so as we explore climate and add in nature and biodiversity, we really enrich the understanding of the organization, of the broader kind of impacts that they may experience, as well as the impacts that they can have through supporting nature and biodiversity. And we'll cover much more of it through the discussion today.
So Megan, help us understand how the linkage of nature and climate affects the business world. And you'll get 100 bonus points if you can bring birds into the discussion.
I think I can do that. That might be my area of expertise. Okay, so if I can ask everybody to do a little imagination experiment with me today. I'm not going to ask you to close your eyes, but if you want to, that's okay. But in your mind's eye, I want you to picture a little bird. And that bird carries seeds that help a forest regenerate. And that forest develops, and the underbrush develops, and the roots develop, and the roots hold the earth in place, preventing a landslide that could have gone across the train tracks that are delivering your goods to their customers. And that forest is messy and diverse, and there's little pockets of wetland in there that slow down the forest fire that is coming for the community where your customers live. And that forest also impacts the local rainfall of a nearby farm, preventing drought from hitting that community. That little forest and one of those seeds that little bird managed to transport, it grows into a Douglas fir. That Douglas fir is sustainably harvested. It is milled. It is turned into timber. A net zero home is built with that Douglas fir. That home is marketed and sold and mortgaged. It's insured. It's furnished. The family sits around the table and the kids have their cereal and the parents have their coffee. And I have just named so many different sectors that you wouldn't naturally think are related to nature, but they are. And so my job at WWF Canada is to make sure that that little bird has a home. If I can give not just an imagination exercise, but a real life example, you may have read headlines about Tropicana orange juice. And orange production has dropped. It's just like the bottoms fell out of her, as they say on the East Coast. It's down the lowest since 1988. And you think, okay, well, yeah, but that's oranges. None of us are in the orange industry. None of us in this room are farmers, I don't think. But it's not just about orange juice. It is about retirement portfolios. It is about shipping. It is about bottling. It is about marketing. So you can see, you don't have to be a farmer or a fisherman to see all these different ways that nature is impacting business and has the potential to impact business even further.
Wow, what a vivid picture. That's amazing.
Thanks.
When you think about it that way. Carolyn, we're living in a time of great economic uncertainty, or call it what you will, chaos. Given that, how are organizations thinking about resilience, especially from the standpoint of nature and sustainability?
Right. So when we think about resilience, we think about it across multiple dimensions. So we think about the operational and financial dimensions, we think about the strategic and reputational dimensions, and we also think about all of the people and the stakeholders who are involved. And when we're thinking about resilience, this component of climate, nature, and biodiversity is becoming more and more a part of this dialogue. And as we've just seen in the story, there are multiple ways that we have these kind of recognized dependencies on nature to provide its ecosystem services that enable our businesses to kind of operate as they've been operating. And as organizations are facing uncertainty, they're looking to new ways of responding to it and thinking about tools that consider broader impacts, such as in nature and biodiversity. We're seeing far more interest in this. And that, for those of us who've been in the sustainability field a long time, is hugely exciting to be bringing this new dimension that can contribute in a positive and commercially effective way to improving the resilience of different organizations. Now, this takes very different forms for different types of organizations, as we've heard through all of the discussions to date. But each organization that we've worked with has been able to bring in dimensions of climate and nature to the ways that they're thinking about resilience, in particular to physical climate risks. So as was mentioned in the preamble, this really high increase in extreme weather events being experienced, enabling there to be resilience against those types of events to improve the certainty of the ability to continue operating when those things happen, given that there is kind of such high uncertainty being experienced at this point in time.
Well, what would be some examples of that?
One of the main examples that we can take from this is within many organizations who have supply chains, while they're evaluating what they're going to do about managing their supply chain going forward, they are kind of looking at some of the broader impacts in the supply chain, not necessarily related to the specific events that are happening right now. And within that, we are seeing organizations thinking about kind of ways of managing their resilience that covers specifically extreme physical risk. and those solutions being taken forward. And many of those are looking at nature-based solutions, so wetland preservation and expansion, and that's in particular to deal with the threat of flood. And increasing solutioning around wildfire and wildfire protection that protects throughout the supply chain, either for the organization itself or organizations that are kind of critical within the supply chain.
Well, Megan, how does WWF Canada fit into this discussion? How do you interact with corporate Canada?
Well, an example came to my mind when Carolyn was speaking just now, actually. And so we have something called the Nature and Climate Grant Program. And so we're helping communities who want to do small-scale restoration in their community. And it's a project that we've been working on with Aviva, actually. And I'll just share an example of one where in BC, in Comox First Nation territory, there's a project called Kuskusum, which means slippery. No, it means very slippery. It has to do with the algae that were originally in that area. There was a sawmill built there, forest cut down in the surrounding area. The logs were milled, maybe not in the most sustainable way, and they did lots of infilling of a marsh nearby. So if you think about the three players here, you know, we've got an insurance company, we've got a First Nation, 4 players. We've got a First Nation, we've got local community outside of that First Nation, and we've got a wildlife organization. We're kind of all driven by different sort of primary goals. Maybe the insurance company's goal, I won't speak for Aviva, but you know, it's about flood mitigation. And how do we restore this so that the landscape's more resilient for that community? That's probably one of the big motivators of the local community too. The local First Nation, their sort of primary motivation is they want fish habitat back. You know, after filling in this marshland where it's like, it's right adjacent to salt water, and they want their fish habitat back. WWF Canada, we're calculating the carbon before in the landscape, it's pretty low, and then we're going to calculate the carbon after the restoration. So one of our primary motivators here is carbon sequestration, because we have a pretty ambitious goal of 30 megatons of avoided, anyway. So we're kind of in it for slightly different reasons, except when you think about it from the highest level, we're absolutely in it for the same reason. So this really beautiful partnership of maybe not the most likely allies, but we are totally likely allies because we're really driven towards this goal of restoring nature.
So what do you hear from your corporate partners?
So I thought that the panel with Roger and Fate, that's what we hear from our corporate partners. That sort of caution around, hey, we're going to keep doing this work, don't worry. But they're not as vocal about how they're talking about it. You wrote a great article about the greenwashing legislation, the anti-greenwashing legislation. I'm an environmentalist. I'm also a recovering lawyer. I should be all for anti-greenwashing legislation, but the way it's rolled out is much different, I think, than the intent of the legislation, and it's really having a chilling effect on a lot of our corporate partners, so I'm definitely hearing that. And then we do also, when we're chatting with corporate partners, they get the net zero. They get carbon emissions. They get that they need to reduce and report. Biodiversity is a little harder to wrap your head around. I'm seeing nods. Yeah, you know, it's harder to wrap your head around in terms of what does this mean for us as a company. And I think it's really interesting to watch the Task Force on Nature-Related Disclosure coming out and what's coming out of that organization. I think it'll become a lot clearer for companies, but right now there's a little bit of, I don't know that that's us. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to get to that disclosure template in a little bit, but I want to kind of change gears a little bit and ask Carolyn. You know, there's a race for capital to fund the low carbon transition. And Carolyn, I was going to ask you this: is this nature discussion a way that Canada can, I don't know, differentiate itself and be competitive? Like, let's talk about the business case for this.
Yes, indeed. So as was just mentioned and has been mentioned earlier in the discussion today, that appetite for green still remains, although it may be a little bit quieter and not necessarily shared as actively. What we are seeing is organizations are still taking decisions to look for green as part of their strategy. So if Canada does choose to focus on kind of certain green projects that can be disclosed in a way that enables attraction of capital to Canada, this could be something that is a key differentiator for those funds or for those investors that are looking for that dimension. Because our discussions that we have are that appetite for that consideration of the risks and opportunities of climate hasn't necessarily changed, because the time horizon of those risks is longer into the future. So those investors that are considering those longer term risks are looking for that consideration of climate. And that includes nature and biodiversity, because those are the ways in which the kind of ecosystem services are delivered, impact many of the businesses that kind of are being looked at by those investors. So this conversation around what can be done to kind of have a dialogue around the preservation and the restoration of nature and biodiversity and deriving economic value from that and gaining a return for it is something that we're seeing still active consideration of, although slightly more quietly given some of the kind of current overtones.
It looked, Megan, like you were taking furious notes tonight.
Well, you know, when Carolyn said, talked about the time horizon being longer, I was reflecting, Carolyn, on our need, and I don't mean WWF, our need to work together in some alliances here. Because alliances can do so much to inspire us to aim higher, and they can also help us think about those longer time horizons, right? Like if I'm company X or if I'm NGO X, it's like, what can I get done this year? But if I'm working with other environmental NGOs or if I'm working with other companies, it's easier, I think, for us to say, okay, what about 10 years from now? What about 20 years from now? Like, what does that look like? So I was just thinking about the need for that collaboration to inspire each other and set those audacious goals.
Yeah, I think we're going to get into that a little bit in a few minutes. And maybe I'll also mention that we might have some time to field some questions, although we've promised that a few times today and didn't deliver, but there's always that chance. So if you've got...
big audacious goal.
Yeah. So one thing that we mentioned a bit earlier, Carolyn, is the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which is modeled on the TCFD in the climate world. Nuts and bolts, basically. So on the climate front, this is well advanced, but where is it in the nature world?
So TNFD is being drafted, and our kind of understanding of the trajectory for that is that it might follow the same pathway of TCFD, which was adopted into IFRS S1 and S2, where TNFD may form S3. And what TNFD is asking for is the same set of content as TCFD, so strategy, governance, risk management, and metrics and targets. However, the focus is on nature, biodiversity, ecosystem, and ecosystem services. And it looks at risks and opportunities, but extends out into the impacts that you have on nature through the operation of your business and the dependencies that you have on those services provided by nature for the operation of your business. Now, our expectation is that TNFD will follow TCFD and kind of flow through in the same way. And here in Canada, we currently have 6 stated early adopters of that. who are working towards their TNFD disclosures. And we'll see as that progresses forward what the narrative around those TNFD disclosures look like. So it's quite an exciting time for organizations really thinking about what story they want to tell related to nature and how that connects to their business and operating model.
May I ask Carolyn a question? Carolyn, I mean, the road to net zero is pretty bumpy right now. The road to everything is pretty bumpy right now. There's a lot of chaos.
A lot of bumps.
TNFD, how's the road looking? I'm dying to know because we've been really relying on this happening, and I don't know what it looks like right now.
So I think that with the pauses that there have been in the adoption of IFRS S1 and S2 in some of the larger markets, we'll have to see what timeline TNFD moves along. But our understanding is that the kind of long-term commitment to it has not moved, but the timing may shift. And as we were speaking about earlier, there is still the option for voluntary disclosure on the basis of TNFD. And if organizations are looking into this and learning more about nature and biodiversity, it is something that can be brought into existing disclosures, perhaps aligned into those climate disclosures or other sustainability or ESG disclosures. However, the formal framework that makes it mandatory in nature is likely quite a few years in the future from now.
Okay, so we're adding a little bit more to the alphabet soup. So can we talk about net zero alliances? What role do they play in this discussion?
As I mentioned earlier, I think they're really great for setting those big long-term goals. As Fate and Roger and others have said today, they're essential for inspiring action. They're essential for building a sense of community around this. Like, we're not in this alone. Sharing innovative ideas, sharing new approaches. I think those alliances are critical. I would add in there the opportunity as well to form alliances with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities and organizations, because as I mentioned at the top, this is an opportunity for us to engage in reconciliation in a really interesting way. There is such an opportunity to also build alliances with both nations and communities and organizations. So not only is it, I think, essential to this work, but there's just so many opportunities to do really interesting things through these alliances.
Carolyn, maybe I can get you to weigh in here.
Yes. So we have seen some movement away from some of the net zero alliances. And when we look at the trajectory of those alliances, they really brought organizations together to help define those first few steps and really understand kind of what does a net zero journey look like for our specific industry. And through those discussions, a lot of bilateral relationships were established that didn't previously exist. So everyone kind of now has a network of phone a friend that has been formalized through the initial years of these alliances. There has been some pressure on those alliances, and some organizations have taken choices to move away from them. And some have changed their priorities and some have not changed their priorities. So the alliances were playing a role, and those conversations are still happening. They've just perhaps changed in nature. And maybe we need different alliances for the future, or maybe organizations have learned what they needed to learn through those alliances. So we'll see where the next step is in terms of the role of alliances and the net zero journey.
Okay. Who's got a question? We've got a mic that can come to you if you've got something to ask over here at the front. Maybe tell us who you'd like to pose the question to.
Well, I'll pose it to WWF. So I'm David Katz from the Ontario Sustainable Energy Association. And we want to see, is there the same way that we put a price on carbon if it's measurable in scope 1 and 2, or even scope 3 as mentioned, but how do we value the restoration of the peak lands or whatever?
Yeah.
Like, what is the monetary benefit that we can show these companies and the directors who are liable for net zero, that there's a monetary value as well in future avoidance of forest fires or whatever?
Yeah, from the perspective of WWF Canada, I mean, that valuation is not our area of expertise, right? That's not something that we want to expand our work in. We're doing the restoration on the ground. I think when others, maybe folks like Carolyn, are trying to figure out how do we do that, one thing I'd caution is that whatever framework is put in place, that it not further exploit the land, further for gain, further exploit Indigenous relationships. We just need to really be careful at how we're looking at nature and putting that value on. I mean, we've done so many things in Canada to alienate Indigenous communities from their territory that we can't do it again in a new form, right? So I think it's folks like Carolyn, folks like Dan O'Brien at PwC, who will do that really great thinking work, and we would just caution some of the lenses that we're putting on it.
All right. Anybody else have? Oh, Carolyn, sorry. If you want to jump in, please do.
Great. So on the valuation of natural assets, there are a number of frameworks that are currently available that have been kind of peer reviewed for use. There are a number even that are being piloted in different government agencies in Canada currently. And we'll have to see kind of what the trajectory of that is. But I would expect that organizations will adopt more and more some of the kind of agreed and approved methodologies for that. And then it'll be telling the story around those assets as to whether they're being protected or how they're being protected, and what the kind of opportunity of those assets being protected is in terms of the protection it provides, in terms of the ecosystem servicing it delivers. So there's quite a lot of complexity in terms of telling the story around the value of those natural assets.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Please join me in thanking Megan and Carolyn for sharing their insights today.
Thank you.
So for the next 35 minutes, no, I'm just kidding. I would like to thank all of our speakers for being so generous with their wisdom and expertise today. And thanks also to you in the audience. On behalf of the Globe and Mail, I'd like to recognize the World Wildlife Fund of Canada and Aviva Canada for sponsoring today's event. And please enjoy our networking reception right outside these doors. So thanks very much, everyone.